welcome everyone to the IDEA Speaker Series. My name is Francis Fong. I'm the engagement lead for IDEA and a senior manager with the Skills Development and Employment Service team at March Times Canada, which is a national charity that provides supports to people with disabilities and a partner with IDEA. Before we begin, please note that we are recording this session and the recordings will be made available on our IDEA website. French interpretation is available for this session. You should be able to toggle between English and French using the interpretation button within Zoom. For those of you who may not know much about IDEA, it is a social innovation laboratory focused on helping create stronger and more diverse labor markets that include persons with disabilities through knowledge to practice. IDEA is the acronym for Inclusive Design for Employment Access. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement relevant to the IDEA National Office in Toronto. Where the National Office of IDEA is situated has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. This acknowledgement is relevant to Toronto, and since we are gathered here virtually, we suggest that you think of the communities in your respective locations as well. This webinar series serves as an opportunity to hear the latest about current topics in the work disabilities policy arena and learn about activities underway within and beyond IDEA. During today's session, the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, we will hold a question and answer period. You can type your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation, and we will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Our speaker for today is Dr. Dan Samosh, who is an assistant professor of employment relations studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He also co-leads one of our incubator hubs at IDEA, focusing on transitions to work and career development. Dr. Samosh is broadly interested in researching the career success and workplace inclusion of individuals with stigmatized social identities. His research is focused on the work experiences of persons with disabilities in particular, including 3 particular foci: leadership emergence of persons with disabilities, disability stigma and social identity, as well as workplace inclusion of persons with disabilities. Dr. Samosh applies a multi-method approach in his research using both qualitative and quantitative methods. His research is applied and often partnered, and theory-driven as well, with practical implications for individuals and organizations and policymakers. So we're very excited to have Dr. Dan Samosh with us today. Thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Francis. So for today, everyone, I'm going to be sharing with you a guide that we published last year. This is something we did through IDEA Hub 3 on school to work transition and career development. So also just a quick thank you to IDEA. This is all funded through that New Frontiers stream. This guide is about career fairs, and it has information for career fair organizers, job seekers, employers, and other actors within this system. But we also, when we made the guide, made it in a way that we hope can be useful for anyone just trying to broadly create an event that is more disability inclusive. I want to acknowledge to the research team. This was a really big research team that went into making this guide because we did a lot of work. There were interviews as well as literature searching, as well as engaging with a lot of people who are running career fairs now. So the research team members are Kim Atwood, Janice Lamb, Jean-Marc Mock, Ava Kwan, Akshay Mohan, Rachel Soderstrom, Arif Jetha, and Sinead McCarthy. And everyone played a really meaningful role in the team. I do want to mention too, one nice thing about this project is that we had Sinead with us, who is with Youth Employment Services. And that means, we always got to learn from Sinead's kind of in the field knowledge. And the guide that I'm going to share with you has also been used by, yes, Youth Employment Services in their own career fairs. And, we've taken feedback from them and others too on how to make sure this is a really practical guide for people. So I'll give you just a brief agenda about where we're going today. I'm only going to give you an overview of some of the guide. The guide is free online, so the details are there for you to find. Today I see more as an opportunity to talk together and to just give you kind of an intro to what the guide is. So we'll begin by just talking about like why are we even focusing on career fairs? Why is this our subject? Then within the guide itself, there are two or three broader sections. The first is about guiding principles. So, how we think about designing a career fair, the intention and thought process that goes into what we want to do. And then the doing part are the practices. So, we give a very, very wide array of different practices you might be able to engage in if you're organizing a career fair or a part of one. We've broadly categorize practices in terms of knowing different participants and then preparing them. And if that doesn't feel clear now, later on I'll go into more detail around that. We talk about the structure of your event because there are so many different ways to run a career fair and they do have implications for who is included. And then with some details on logistics, coordination, and communication. And last, the guide ends with a really substantial resource list. I think it might actually be something around 15 pages. The idea being that we're sharing all this information on career fairs, but ultimately there are many other event type guides that are relevant, and we share a lot of those with you so that you hopefully have a space to draw from when you are creating an event and trying to make sure that it's accessible and inclusive. From there, at the end, I'll just share a little bit about some other Hub3 projects that are going on within IDEA. We just published a resource on ADHD for managers, but really for anyone in organizations to understand ADHD better. There's work on mentorship in the works and also work on episodic disability. And then we'll go to discussion, and I'm hoping we get to engage and I can answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so our part one, disability inclusive career fairs, and really the guide that we're working with. Well, when we were trying to determine what research to do, we spoke a lot with our kind of advisory group, with people who were engaging in the school to work transition, also nonprofits, employers, and so on. And we regularly heard that career fairs were a really important gateway to employment, and that they were also one where job seekers with disabilities were regularly excluded. Some of the ways that exclusion kind of occurred would be things like, let's say there's a career fair and there's no process for requesting accommodation. So people right off the bat, might not know whether they can ask, should ask, whether their request will be accepted or not, this kind of thing. We also heard, especially from students with disabilities, that formats of career fairs can often disadvantage some job seekers. And so in this case, we had, some job seekers who identified as neurodivergent, stating, this idea of having a table at a career fair, let's say, with an employer and several students or several job seekers around that employer created a lot of stress for some people and wasn't really an environment wherein they could thrive. And of course, this is important because that individual might be great for the job. It's just the environment that's the issue here. And we also saw that there is limited guidance on how to do disability inclusion at career fairs. We have some great guidance around events in general, but for career fairs specifically, there's not as much there. And here I do want to pause too for a moment and just mention that one of the things about that that's really meaningful and that I think we see broadly within the disability inclusion and workspace is we're getting more and more kind of context specific guides out, which is great because we've heard for so long from people that, this industry needs some different guidance than that industry, or this experience needs different guidance from that experience. And career fairs are their own unique type of event, so we can give some very particular guidance. But with that, it means that it can be harder to get the word out that the guide exists because, it might be harder to find the career fair guide versus the general inclusion events guide. So while I'm kind of sharing this presentation, if you don't mind, if you could also think about who might benefit from receiving this and if you could share it with them. I know we've had a lot of success with people, particularly in nonprofits that run career fairs, and also within career services at universities, because this guide really speaks a lot to their work. But if there's anyone else you can think of, please, let them know about the guide, because we're excited to get the word out. So, research background, where did all of this come from? We did about 30 interviews with people from various experiences, many people transitioning into work that identified as having a disability, some employers, some career services people, some nonprofit people, and so on from there. We had many discussions with our kind of advisory group, and we also did a fair bit of literature searching around what best practice was. And I want to emphasize this wasn't just academic researching, because a lot of the most up-to-date practice isn't happening in academia. Academia, right, we're often a few years behind because of the time it takes to do research. So we really emphasized focusing on practices that are going on now and ways to make things inclusive, rather than some process that kind of keeps us a bit more in the past. So our emphasis is on supporting those running career fairs. And one of the things we heard from many people running career fairs is that they're resource constrained. Uh, they really want to be doing a lot of different things and making their career fairs inclusive. But in these times of often budget cuts and these kind of austerity measure times, there's often not that many people on the team. So a lot of our practices and suggestions are especially geared towards being low cost to no cost, and in particular, often highlighting opportunities for cross-organizational or inter-organizational collaboration so that these kinds of things can get done without kind of meeting certain barriers that are often discussed. And do just want to mention too, I mentioned earlier that this work was partnered with Sinead McCarthy at Youth Employment Services, and so we had lots of help and work with Yes in order to kind of make this guide useful. So I'm going to go inside the guide now. What I've done before is just really background. And the guide begins with principles. So how to think about running a career fair. And these are really important because we thought if we just give people a bunch of practices, then if we engage in practices without reflexivity, if we engage in practices without thinking why we're engaging in them, we might accidentally do something that we think is helpful that isn't. Because there is no perfect list of practices, right? Every context is different and we need to respect that. So, in brief, our first principle is nothing about us without us. As much as we can, we are adding persons with disabilities into the design process, into the process of creating the career fair. Now, point two largely came from interviewees who were job seekers, saying that they would often find themselves in situations where maybe there was a career fair or something of this nature, but it wasn't really focused on meaningful and competitive employment. And what they wanted was a job that paid fairly, and so on. So, to as much as we can focus on competitive employment, and the term meaningful will come up later in the practices, so I'll talk about it then. Point three is respecting the complexity of the individual. An important caveat when looking at a guide that is disability focused is that we unintentionally might think that disability is the only thing in focus. But for many people, for some, disability is a really important primary identity. For many other job seekers, it's just a part of themselves and often a very neutral part. So just respecting that it's the person's role to identify who they are, not the organizer's role. Part four, taking a strength-based view. Again, we often heard that there could be the potential that organizers will assume what the person is capable of, but instead, taking a balanced view, understanding that everyone has strengths and weaknesses. But when we're thinking about getting a job, when we're thinking about career fairs, focusing on what that person can do, what their strengths are, what their aptitude is, and what they might want to build on in the future. Now, the fifth point is one that comes up in guidance, especially around kind of event structure and engaging around accommodation processes. First being proactive and next being flexible. I think this is reasonable guidance for anyone in a kind of leadership role or an organizing role. First, we be proactive, we prepare as much as we can, and in the guide, you can notice these things where, we talk about different ways to be accessible around communication. We talk about accessibility in terms of documentation and so on. So do all of those things, but recognize that we can't predict every situation. And when we come up with something that we weren't expecting, whether it be the day of the event or a week before or a week after, being flexible, not, entering into a defensive position, but saying, okay, how can we make this work and collaborate together? And that kind of segues to the next point. A big part of this guide is emphasizing collaboration. We can't do everything alone, and so we share a list of different potential collaborators and what they might be able to do at your career fair. Now, the seventh point, this one is about context, that context matters. And this is just to make sure that this guide isn't used as a checklist, but to say that you know your context better, than any of us as writers of a guide could know. So take everything that we write within your context. Think about who it is who is at your career fair, employers, job seekers, and so on, and make sure to, filter everything we write through that context. And the last point is around continuous improvement. We can't be perfectionistic about these things. Instead, it's better to grow. And each time, each next career fair, do a better job. And so each of these principles, you'll see that they play a role in the practices that come up next. So from principles to practices, broadly, when looking at different actors within this kind of career fair system, we're thinking about job seekers, employers, and other collaborators. And for job seekers and employers in particular, the guide is framed around knowing who job seekers and employers are, and then preparing them for the career fair. So next I'll get into some information about job seekers, that kind of knowing and preparing framing. So knowing your job seekers, we heard quite regularly from job seekers that organizers might assume what their interests are, and that their interests are actually very wide and varied, and you wouldn't know what those interests are probably unless you talk to the person. So it being very important to engage with job seekers before the career fair happens. And in the guide, we talk about different ways of doing that engagement. I won't go into that here. But some of the interests we heard from folks were, whether they want to get a job in an urban or a rural setting. Some were interested in trades, office work, and others. Many people spoke actually about the importance of being in jobs that had lateral growth opportunities. And by that, I mean jobs that, even though the title might stay the same, the responsibilities might vary and grow over time. And we also heard a fair bit about upward career mobility, the desire to, one day move into management positions and so on. Now, in particular, an emphasis that was made by participants, specifically job seekers, was a desire to access what they deemed meaningful work greater than just a job. And a big part of what meaningful work was to a lot of people was being in inclusive workplaces. And that meant primarily having colleagues who respected them, whose company that they enjoyed, but also managers and the organization more broadly. And in terms of thinking as a career fair organizer, at this point, we have career stage differences and first generation post-secondary students listed there. We heard from some job seekers about how, some are very, very early in their job search process, and they really just want to know what jobs are out there. Maybe they're not applying for a job yet, but they want to know what they might be able to get, versus someone who, let's say we have a post-secondary student who's in their fourth year, they're really focused on getting a job potentially now. So knowing that as an organizer, who are the job seekers coming to this event? What career stage and kind of job search focus do they have? And we heard within the post-secondary context as well, although acknowledging many career fairs do not happen in that context, right? But within the post-secondary context, a lot of people mentioned that being first generation post-secondary students was an important part of their experience and wanting to have support based on that kind of role and experience within the university. Now, a last point that was mentioned that is often forgotten is transportation access needs. So, if an event is listed 2 weeks before the event is going to happen, someone might not be able to get transportation to that event. It might, they might not have enough time. So, making sure that an event is both in an accessible location and also that time enough is given so that, a person can get transportation to the event. Now, on this slide, and on several of the remaining ones that are practice focused, I just have this little box here of highlights. So some things that you can do to prepare job seekers specifically. The first portion being about knowing them and understanding them is that as an organizer, before the event, you can always run things like different workshops if you have the capacity. And we heard, especially again in post-secondary context, that students really understand, well, often understand accommodation within the university. But that doesn't mean that they understand accommodation within the workplace. It's a totally different experience, right? They do not have the same structure of accommodation system. So helping students understand what does disclosure look like if they so choose to disclose in a workplace context, and what does accommodation, what does that seem to be too? Now, there's all the usual stuff too around job readiness, and then other things like students and job seekers stating they would have really benefited with just a little bit of practice, maybe to learn, how do they interact with employers? It might be a first experience interacting with a manager or an HR person or a representative from an organization. So having a bit of training there can be really helpful. And also just demystifying the hiring process. As an organizer and someone in that kind of position, it can be easy to forget that, we all who are in these jobs had to get jobs and went through that process and at the beginning really didn't know what that process was. So demystifying the hiring process can be really meaningful for job seekers too. Next, we'll look at employers. So there are so many different practices relating to employers in the guide. Just a few of them. If we go in the order of the guide and first understand our job seekers, then the next step is to ask, what employers do these job seekers want to meet with? So inviting employers who actually match our job seeker interests, our job seeker goals, and so on. And then we can start thinking too about preparing our employers. We heard a lot about how just even something as simple as education on different models of disability, making sure people don't only come in with a solely medical model view of disability is important. Talking about the social model, affirmative model, and so on from there. Teaching about inclusive communication practices, which we list some within the guide, accommodation conversations, how to do those, and also how to produce accessible presentations, right? Because often we have these Bristol board presentations or maybe a PowerPoint or something like that. So you know how to do documentation in an accessible way and the presentation too. Mm. From there, from job seekers, we heard from a lot of them that they wanted employers to share about their DEIA initiatives. So to really highlight those if those are ongoing. And then other preparation activities can be similar to with job seekers, having kind of pre-career fair events, whether that be webinars, more informal lunch and learns where resources can be shared with employers, and the career fair can be seen kind of as a touch point. So even though we're doing a career fair, you can also share much more, right, around how to be an inclusive employer more broadly. Now, one practice that we heard about by a really impressive, I think, career fair organizer was the idea in our highlight box of formalizing an employer contract. So saying to employers, if you're going to be a part of this career fair, we just also have this contract that we'd like you to read over, we can discuss, and then you can sign. And the contract will have information about expectations, potentially around acceptable and unacceptable behavior, goals of the career fair, some of the principles that I shared earlier. Those could be a part of something like a contract to make sure that your employers grasp the purpose of the career fair and are then engaging in inclusive and accessible ways at the career fair. So from there, right, I talked about job seekers, knowing your job seekers, preparing them. Employers, knowing your employers and preparing them. Next, I'll talk just a little bit about collaborators. The main focus here is often in this work, right? People are just busy and it can be very hard to know who might be able to help and whether they are actually willing to help. And I think one of the most enjoyable things about being an academic is that I get to talk to a lot of people about what they're passionate about and what they know really well. And it's so, so common that individuals from these various groups, and I'll name these groups in a moment, individuals from these various groups mention that, they wish they could coordinate with X, Y, or Z, but they don't have much success with it or they don't know how. And then you hear the exact same thing from the other side saying, oh, we wish we could coordinate with this other group. So really being open to exploring some of these collaborations with employment service providers, job coaches, service provider networks, community organizations led by persons with disabilities, professional associations and regulatory bodies, chambers of commerce, post-secondary institutions. Within them, there are different functions, right? Career services, accessibility services, and alumni services. All three could play a role in career fairs, but usually it's only one, and there might not be actually cross collaboration between. And then we have other actors like mentors, guest speakers, and role models, and applied research organizations. So all of these kind of different people, groups, organizations could be a part of career fairs and could make them better, could make them more inclusive. So those are the people and groups involved in a career fair. Next, I'll talk a little about event structure and then logistics and coordination. And that'll be the main body of my discussion of the guide. And then we can, go into more conversation together. So in the event structure, this is one place where nothing about us without us is very important. Having people on the, committee or the team that runs the career fair that designs it who actually have experience with disability. Now, while making that structure of an event, there are so many different options you have. So it's very important to know what your job seekers' needs are and what their interests are, because an event could be disability focused or it could be not disability focused. Now, we heard, it really depends on the person. Some people would express that they don't want to go to a disability focused event because it kind of outs them, and maybe they don't want to disclose. And as well, maybe they just don't want disability to be the main emphasis. Maybe, their real emphasis is that they want to get a job and disability is just some piece of their identity. Whereas other people really did say that they would be happy to go to a disability specific event. Now you can have one-on-one employer, one employer to one job seeker type events, or you can have one employer to multiple job seeker type events. And you can also have events that are industry, occupation, or profession specific, or just, involve all the employers who want to join and are maybe something a bit more general. Now, the career fair is also an opportunity to share about other career supports that are available, especially within organizations like universities and colleges, but within any context, really. And for some of our job seekers, we heard that that was an opportunity to reduce pressure a bit. Because if we think about, the first time speaking to an employer, it can be really stressful. So to not make the entire event about engaging with employers for job seekers can actually help a lot. One way of doing that too is to integrate peer mentorship or mentorship of other forms within the event. Because we also found many people expressing that, they were hoping to meet other people with similar experiences to themselves. And an unintended outcome of career fairs was they actually got to meet some really nice people who are job seekers too. And they got to coordinate and learn about their experience and kind of grow together. And then within this too, as mentioned in the principles, we have this plan, do, check, act cycle of, you should experiment with these things. It's never going to be perfect, and instead try to figure out what works for people over time. And one example that worked for some of the career fair organizers we spoke with is always having a post-career fair survey. So asking the participants about what their experience was, what they liked, what they would change, this sort of thing. And in our highlight box here on the right, there's this idea of a reverse career fair. So this is a concept that if you know your job seekers well, it might actually really work for them, and it might be a concept you want to implement. So the typical career fair, right, involves booths where you have employers and then job seekers go to those booths, right? But you can reverse that and have job seekers hosting booths, right? The job seeker can prepare their own board or whatever it might be and prepare, information about who they are, and then employers would actually circulate around the room, around the auditorium, wherever this is held. And we learned that for many job seekers, this idea could reduce a lot of social pressure because they don't have to be the one who's breaking the ice by going to the employer. Of course, this is very idiosyncratic. Some other job seekers would say quite the opposite. But for many, it's an opportunity to showcase their strengths in a bit more of a proactive and comfortable way. Turning to logistics, coordination, and communication, this part of the guide has a lot of very detailed information, which I'm not going into here, but just like some of our points, having early notice is very important. Certain types of technology or supports take time, right? If we need an interpreter, it's going to take time to find one. Transport can often take time. And so giving early notice, ideally much more than a month, but at least a month in advance so that there's time to coordinate these things. having an accessible registration process and response to registration, making the accommodation process clear. We in the guide talk about what you should include in accommodation-related correspondence, how to address accommodation requests, and we actually also have a sample statement around accommodations within the guide too. Learning and just being aware of what local transportation looks like in your area, and also preparing for communication access, documentation, physical location type access, and making sure that you schedule in breaks. It's impressive how many people we heard from who said they actually just really needed a break at some point, but the event was something that kind of kept on going, and then it had, an effect on them, and it would have been a better experience with some breaks. And of course, if you can do a trial run, especially for things like assistive technology and that kind of thing, now, in our highlight box here, in terms of logistics and coordination and communication, we have roles at the event. So within the guide, we detail different roles that people might play in order to make the event work on the day of. Now, all of these roles could be one person, or each one could be a different person, or even multiple people. So making sure you have an event contact, right? If you have an accommodation process, you have to say who the person is connecting with. You have to make sure that people know who it is they can email or otherwise to engage with the event. Having accessibility and accommodation coordinator, having wayfinders, individuals at the event who help people navigate the space. Often these events are in auditoriums. It can be hard to navigate through them, so having people there who are available should someone need. Tech support, both for assistive technology and general technology. And then one practice I really liked that we learned about from a career services individual was having someone around who is kind of networking support. Someone who, if the job seekers want, if they've requested, then that networking support person can just go up and say, start the conversation, help, as was described, turn cold connections into warm connections, and just make it a little bit easier to engage with employers. So the last part of the guide is this lengthy resource list. The resource list is detailed by the different participants, so job seekers, employers, other collaborators, and then subtopics within that, knowing them, preparing them, and so on. There's a lot of detail there. If you do use the guide, I hope that part is helpful. We wanted to make sure that we got the most important stuff within the guide itself, that is kind of most important to career fairs, but there are so many amazing event-focused guides out there around disability inclusion that we didn't feel the need to reinvent any of those. In those cases, we said if you want general events information and so on, go to these other guides. And last on this slide, I've included the link to the career fair guide. It's free through the IDEA website, and these slides should also be posted at some point too. But if you don't want to wait and you want to get access to it, you can always email me and I'd be happy to, share the guide with you. Okay, so that is the career fair guide. I just have a little bit more to share around other work that we're doing in Hub 3 with IDEA. So the first one is just, I think, last week, we published a guide on ADHD and career success, which really details like the barriers that an individual might experience and the facilitators of career success that an individual might experience, and especially focusing on those facilitators. And this guide, though for anyone, it's particularly written in a way that is catered to managers in the hope that managers can get a bit of a better understanding, not just of ADHD, which we give some background in, but how to be respectful of their employees with ADHD and how to work well with them. And the URL for that guide is also at the bottom of this slide. You can also access it through the IDEA website. And I think it was in the last newsletter too, if you get those. Now, an ongoing project that we haven't sent out into the world yet, but two of these are kind of in different stages. We're creating some guidance now on how to design disability inclusive mentorship programs. And I have to mention Ansha Ahmed, who is at Queen's University with me working as a postdoc. She has done some amazing work on this, and we're both really excited to get this out to the community. We've heard time and time again how mentorship is something, an area where guidance is kind of lacking. And so we've gone really deep into how to design mentorship programs, which hopefully can be helpful in the audiences here, your future practice. And then we also might end up running a future mentorship program too. So if you're at an organization where you might want to be a part of that, let us know, because if we can make it work, we will, and we'd love to use all of this research we've done around mentorship, all this engagement we've done with people who run these programs to try to make a really good mentorship program and then see how it works. Last around research that is ongoing, this is a request from Megan Crouch, is a postdoc at the Institute for Work and Health. Uh, we're also doing the study on episodic disability, which Megan and Arjeta are leading. It's a kind of longitudinal study of career success from the experiences of individuals who are 18 to 35 years old transitioning into work who also experience episodic disability. So if you know anyone who might want to be a part of that study, you'll get access to these slides, or you can, contact Megan at IWH. Please do, because I think that will be a meaningful study as well. And the only thing left for me to say before the Q&A is thank you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation part of this. And yeah, we'll get into the conversational part.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dan Samosh, for your insight and the research that brings principles to practices. I personally really enjoy when you talked about engaging job seekers before the career fair and making sure that you try to get to know them as best as you can before it happens. I personally have some experience with that career fair as well, and I really do find that that's a really nice setup. I also really like the idea of the reverse job fair, and in fact, I think it's becoming a bit more popular. So I'm glad that you're able to identify that as a really a good way to be inclusive. So we're going to open up the question and answers now from the audience. And if you are new to the Zoom platform, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you click on that, a separate window should open up, and you should be able to then type in your questions. And we are going to try to answer as many questions as we can. We do have a little bit of time. So I am going to read out the first question I see, and for you, Dr. Samish. So the first question I have here from the audience, for certain industries, specific requirements such as like licenses for different occupations may be necessary. What are your thoughts on conducting pre-screening before a job fair?
So it depends to an extent on what is meant by pre-screening, but what I'll share about there is one of the actors we mentioned are professional associations and licensing bodies. And these can be really meaningful groups to bring to career fairs who often aren't engaged in them because it's an environment and a space where job seekers can then learn really what are those licensing requirements. So I think in general, inviting those kinds of actors and also groups like chambers of commerce too, right? These organizations we aren't necessarily thinking of because they might not be the ones doing the hiring, but they are really important organizations that help an individual job seeker learn what is this industry, what is this context? What do I need to do to get that kind of job, right? Often, especially if someone maybe hasn't had a job before, their idea of that job might not be representative of what it is. And those kind of licensing bodies can often give way more information than, a single representative from an organization. So I think if it's pre-screening in terms of, who do we have involved here? Do we have a wide enough array of these kind of collaborator contributors who are ensuring that the job seekers get a broad enough and deep enough understanding of the field, then yeah, I think it could be really nice. It could be a nice addition to the kind of work we do.
Yeah, thank you. Bringing the right players and the collaboration, and then making sure that we also think about from the job seeker's perspective. I guess it's incorporating the inclusive lens. So yeah, thank you for the response. There is a comment from the audience to add to the importance of having access to washroom for wheelchair users from an accessibility perspective as well. So obviously not just the structure of the career fair itself, but also the environment as well too. So thank you for the comment that we have there.
If I can
Um,
add to that too,
yeah.
Francis, just imagine it's a really important comment. And within the guide, we go into much more detail about kind of accessibility within space, accessibility within events. But then we also share other guides that would have this important point and then many, many others too. Because of course, like the goal is to have an event where every element is accessible and washrooms, the space, the entrance to the building, and many other aspects of this are really important to have in mind too.
Right. Yeah, thank you. There is a question here. This is more about like follow up with you, I think, or perhaps with Megan and some other folks on your team as well about how do they get in touch to discuss the mentorship part of it. So, to be
Mm.
able to maybe share an email contact or anything like that.
Yeah, so if it's about the mentorship piece, that's something specifically that Ansha Ahmed and myself are working on. So you can feel free to send me an email. It would be great to get a message from you and from anyone else in the room, because
Great.
we're early stages in that. So actually, if you end up being a part of it, there's a lot of room to kind of grow together and explore. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Sounds great. Okay. So moving on to another question. So, was there any research done on digital platforms used for online job fairs? The comment from the attendee says that she knows it's hard to find ones that are accessible out of the box sometimes. So,
Yeah.
what would be a recommendation to employers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for us in the guide, we primarily were looking at physical in-person job fairs and then hybrid job fairs too. And so there is some guidance in the guide around hybrid job fairs. But perhaps it's kind of a gap of ours and something that the next iteration of the guide can include. We don't have much information about online only job fairs. So I don't have like a specific piece of technology or software that I would say
Mhm.
that's the good one to use. Um, but rather, that would be one of those moments again where if we start within the format of the guide and focus on the job seekers first, then asking, okay, what do our job seekers really want and what are they looking for, and then choose based on that. But I'm sorry, I don't have like a quick, easy answer.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that's maybe an area where the community kind of get together and think about that a bit and exchange some tips and so on related to that. I want to go back to the reverse job fair. The reverse job fair, the premise of that is kind of having the employers go around and going to the actual job seekers. And in terms of like preparation, like how do you see that work out? Because employers may not be so familiar with, interacting with people with disabilities in general. They may be a bit shy to kind of do that. So how do you get that into the preparation part?
Yeah, so it's really important, right? Like we know that when people are uncomfortable, then they tend to avoid. And this is one of the things we constantly see in the disability inclusion space of like well-intentioned employer who doesn't understand that an experience is just an experience and then goes like, oh, I'd rather just avoid the context out of fear and this sort of thing. So I think that's a place where some of this pre-training can be really helpful. And there are so many good guides there around how to communicate in an accessible manner. Whether that be, I know out of Quebec, there's an organization called CRISPESH, which made a guide on neuromixed communications, which really beautifully details, how to engage in communication between kind of autistic and allistic communities. So giving resources like that, potentially having sessions beforehand to help make employers make sure they kind of understand how to communicate, how to engage. And also just within this too, it's the comment I made earlier around the one kind of some of our principles about respecting the context, respecting a strength-based view, and also not only focusing on disability. Ultimately, we have a person in front of us, and disability is potentially just one part of
Right.
that experience. And we focus so much here because of all the stigma and all of the discrimination. But fundamentally, we want to be framing this as here's a job seeker and here's an employer. And here's employer, here's how to do your job better. Job seeker, here's how to engage with employers within this context, that sort of thing.
Right, I see. Thank you. And speaking of like kind of a pre-career fair kind of preparation things, and attendee asked that if you're aware of any pre-existing content for kind of like pre-fair webinar, what may needs to be in there. I know you mentioned some guides about how it interact with, certain individuals, but can you maybe expand on that?
Yeah, so first, I also noticed the question kind of asking for like, does this content exist somewhere? And I think it's one of the nicest things about this research and ideas research more broadly too, around having this partnered component. I wish Sinead was here with me because I know Yes has so much amazing material. And a lot of this pre-fair information is also just like how to be a reasonable, decent person information, how to be an inclusive employer type information that can be used in many other contexts too. So I think organizations like Yes and so many others have really good information that could be shared. But as you mentioned, Francis, like some of that information is around communication. Some of it too is like around how to share documentation. So what does an accessible document look like? What formats are we using when we're
Right.
sharing information with people? How do we engage with people, from different communities and from different experiences? And also, I think too, in the effort to mitigate that avoid response, which is so common, and I think like so many in the service provider field experience of like employer wants to help, employer is afraid, employer doesn't help, is being there and just saying like you don't need to know everything. We're also here to support you in that, to taking that principle of first being proactive, learn as much as you can, take all these resources, but fundamentally also knowing the career fair organizer has lots of knowledge too. Maybe even another role we could have added to that list is like an employer support. Someone
Mhm.
when the employer has questions, when they don't know what to do, they can turn to that person. That kind of thing can be really helpful to demystify and reduce some of the stress.
Right, right. Okay, well, that's great. I have one more question. Earlier on, you mentioned that career advancement, and sometimes it will be good to for job seekers to kind of have some understanding of what may be possible within that organization with that employer in the career fair. This is kind of a sensitive part, right? Sometimes when there are, they're looking for kind of someone to come in and maybe the first time they've been to a career fair that have an inclusive lens and may have job seekers with disabilities and for employers to kind of really talk about like potential career events may be a bit taunting, and so on. So what are the extents on this? Is that again more about getting to know about the job seekers? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two sides. The first is getting to know the job seekers, as you mentioned. What is it that they really want? Because as described earlier too, like some people really want jobs where there's predictability. Some people really want jobs where there's lateral growth, but they don't have a desire to advance. Other people have this advancement desire. So to know who is the group that is coming in. But then also, I think a really big part of that and why it was important to write it in is that both in the research and in the practice kind of communities, there's often the assumption that the person doesn't want to advance their career. And it's a really problematic assumption, right? So I think just having that in mind that we're dealing with individuals and everyone has different interests and wants and needs, and that career advancement is often a really big part of that picture. I think it can be nice for employers to start off with that recognition, especially if it's a disability specific career fair. And especially if they haven't been prepared properly for it, because otherwise, all of these pervasive and kind of problematic assumptions that we see, we run the risk of just having them show up at the event and not really having the intended effect.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really like the career fair guide just personally because I have some experience working with employment service provider, and I really like the fact that things are practical. That if you're maybe a bit new to the process, you can kind of follow in step by steps, and then if you gain a little bit more experience, you can always kind of like think about it from the principles perspective and tweak it and kind of build it on your own. But I think this is a tremendously helpful tool for the community, and thank you for sharing that with us today. And you mentioned a few more things that Hub 3 and your team and engaging research are working on as well. So we're looking forward to all those things too. And and hopefully our audience will also keep in touch with us and check out the tool resources. So I'm not seeing many more questions, but there's one more that come in, and it looks like we still have a few minutes. So would you mind taking this one on as well?
With pleasure, yeah.
Okay, so the question says that do you prepare this guide for use for anyone globally, or is that more of a Canadian context when it was developed?
Yeah, so the intention while making the guide was that it should be helpful for anyone, anywhere. But of course, I think it's our seventh principle that context matters. Probably the further someone is from where we are, the more likely we are unintentionally, making it something that, okay, this part is helpful, that part isn't so helpful. So two things I would say to that. One is the guide was written in a way, kind of, Francis, as you mentioned, that if you're someone who is running a career fair for the first time and you're like, I don't know what to do, the guide can really help you in a step-by-step manner go through all of this. Instead, if you're someone who's run many career fairs, you're comfortable with it, then the guide, I think, is more of a piece that you can turn to and go, what are some smaller parts of this guide that I haven't considered that I might want to integrate
Mhm.
into my work rather than needing that, step-by-step component. And then also this principled element of, first off, are any of these principles things I haven't thought about? And then also, what principles might you add as well if you're more advanced in this? Like we didn't discuss as much universal design. It's kind of embedded in some of the other principles, but if you have a lot of knowledge and background there, that might be something more central for you. So I do think this can be useful in other contexts outside of Canada. But with
Mhm.
that said, too, a big purpose of this research is to get it out and to get people using it and also to share it. So, to the question asker, if there's ever any opportunity to rework the guide, like if you have a specific context in mind where after you read the guide, you're like, some of this is useful, some of it isn't so useful. I'd love to talk about reworking it because, the goal isn't to write it and then move on to the next thing. It's to write it and share it and have as many people as who can be helped by it and use it. So yeah, please, another opportunity to maybe get in touch with me if you want to email.
Yeah, thank you for offering that follow-up support. It's so important that we continue to reflect and improve. And even earlier on, you mentioned about after career guide, it's always good to have survey or evaluation process in place as well too. That's great. Well, thank you once again for being here, Dr. Samosh, and for sharing the work that you've done with your team. And I want to thank the French interpreter for helping us today as well. And as a reminder for the audience, the recordings for our speaker series will be posted on our IDEA website, which is www.VRAI-idea.ca when they become available. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the speaker series, you can also contact us at info@very-idea.ca. I've been reminded that if you're in the attendance and you require a certificate or proof for attending this webinar, please contact our national office through the same email address, info@very-idea.ca, which is typed into the chat. Um, and thank you for everyone for spending the time with us today, and hope we can see you next time in the next speaker series session.